Welcome to the second episode of this talk with industry experts. We've got Charles Betz himself here, who is actually principal researcher analyst with the Forrester Group, and his main focus of study and research areas are Devops, service management, IT4IT, and he's an author of a couple of books. And this is in continuation with our previous talk that we had. Charles, actually, just want to dwell upon your association with IT4IT. What's been the history behind that? How did it come into focus? I'm sure you played a big part in its evolution, and it kind of resonates with your idea of there should be an ERP for IT in your cobbler's right. Children are without any footwear kind of book that you sold. There is because IT is quite orphaned and there are not many people to actually run IT like a business. Can you walk us through that journey on how your association with IT4IT has been and its history as well? Because I'm sure you're the right person to answer all of that.
Right. So I first came across the term ERP for IT in the year 2003. I saw an article that was an eWeek interview with the then CIO of General Motors, Ralph Shigenda, who was calling for ERP for IT. Now, what Ralph was calling for was not ultimately what I wound up pursuing and studying. Ralph was he was trying to figure out something more like what we would today call SIAM, for supplier integration and management. He was interested in rationalizing a heavily outsourced IT operating model at General Motors. And he started calling this ERP for IT. Ultimately, I think that that's not where the industry went, and there was good reasons for that, but that was the state of the discussion 17 years ago. I picked up on ERP for IT, however, because I had been running these tools called metadata repositories, and you hardly hear about them anymore. This was before the notorious ITIL Cmdb. In fact, one of the first kind of career-defining questions I had was, what's the difference between a metadata repository and a Cmdb? And at the time I said, I don't know, what's a Cmdb? Well, okay. 17 years later, I have a pretty good opinion about what a Cmdb is. It's been
I think I pretty like your mention of the word notorious to it because it's the root cause of a lot of problems if it's not configured well.
Yeah.
So continues.
Yeah, that. The Cmdb is still kind of an unsolved problem, but that's a story. We can get to that later. So I began to view what I was doing, and this was I was at Best Buy at the time. I was running their metadata repository, building and running it. I was actually a product manager for their metadata repository. And the challenges I was running into was making a business case, trying to understand why the company would invest in something like this to begin with. And trying to understand from there, well, do we understand IT? I mean, I had a system, the beginnings of a system that was providing an overall set of inventory and dependencies, a bill of materials for the business of IT. And of course, data is not worth anything without process. I knew that much, from being a consultant at Anderson Consulting. And I had my background in ERP systems. I'd, cut my teeth on PeopleSoft, PeopleSoft HR, PeopleSoft Financials. And so then the question arose, well, why is Ralph Shigenda calling for ERP for IT? And what does this mean to me? And what can I do with this? So I reserved the domain name, ERP4IT.
Yeah, I think you had a blog also on there.
I did. I've subsequently, I took that blog down. I got tired of paying TypePad $12 a month. I'm not supposed to have an independent blog as a Forrester analyst. If I had just left it alone, I could have probably left it up there and nobody would have said anything because I wasn't adding anything to it. And there was some historical material of interest, but ultimately I just was looking at my finances and I said, I don't want to pay $12 a month to type ad to keep that blog up indefinitely.
True.
I did download it all to a PDF, and anybody who wants can have the PDF. So that's a standing offer.
People okay. Where is it available, Charles? Is it available somewhere in the public domain?
You have to ask me. But
okay. I will at the end of this. Yes.
Yeah. I could. Yeah, it's just like on a Dropbox.
Okay.
So I started, and then I started to think more. I started reading ITIL. And at this time, I also took a course in software engineering. I took a master's in software engineering, my degree back there. And this was an ideal opportunity to start studying in a more systematic and rigorous way what we meant by ERP for IT. And I brought in a whole bunch of other concepts like IT portfolio management. There was a lot of books going around about the business of IT, managing the business of IT, the real business of IT, by high-level consultants at companies like Accenture and KPMG and all the rest. And I was immersing myself in all of that. I was immersing myself in the work of other industry analysts, at all the analyst firms who were starting to write a little bit about related topics. Certainly, I read ITIL cover to cover, both version 2 and version 3. I read every word.
This was way back in which year, Charles?
This is about 2005.
Oh, okay.
And
so it was V2 or something at that point of time?
That was V2, yeah. And V3 came out and then I started by about 2004, I decided I wanted to write a book. And I started to get interest from Morgan Kaufman Elsevier for the first edition of my book. Which has the most bizarre cover, the baby shoes. Making shoes for the cobbler's children. They put a pair of baby shoes on it. I don't ask. It's not a
true.
At that point, because I was at Accenture at that point, working at Best Buy, but I was part of the services organization, not part of the consulting organization. In any event, I wasn't distinguished enough to write a book. And so they weren't going to let me write a book. They owned all my intellectual property and they said, we're not going to let you write a book. And so I said, bye. And I went to Wells Fargo.
Wells Fargo? Buy to Andersen Consulting.
Yeah, I said it was Accenture at the time.
Okay.
I had started it. So this is where it gets confusing. I had worked for Andersen Consulting 98 through 2000. It changed its name to Accenture in 2000 or late 99.
True. Yeah.
Enron, fall of Arthur Andersen, a whole bunch of history, not that interesting. And then when I went to Target, and then I went to Best Buy. And when I was at Best Buy outsourced all of its IT to Accenture, and I found myself working unwillingly for Accenture again.
Okay. Actually, I just had one anecdotal experience when you said Andersen Consulting. I had an offer way back in 96, 97, Andersen Consulting at that point of time in Texas for the Texas A&M Texas unit. But I didn't take it at that point of time. And pretty much all the interviewers were dressed like the way you're dressed up today with the blazers inside and jackets. So there were some 4 or 5 PhDs on the panel, and it was like pretty much like the show in the movies. I think that was the only one which was of that level. And after that, it was pretty much, I think pretty much like the IT crowd, general stuff. Yes, Charles, sorry to interrupt you. Please go ahead.
No, it's all right. So I'm there at Best Buy. I'm wanting to write a book. Accenture's not letting me write a book. And I had an opportunity to go to Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo said, we don't care if you write a book, just leave our name out of it. And so I wrote Architecture and Patterns. And then I went through a career at Wells Fargo that was kind of a defining moment. I was the chief architect, acting, de facto chief architect for the business of IT. My formal title was lead architect, but I sat on the chief architects council or the senior architects council. So at any event, I was the go-to person for all questions related to the business of IT. And ultimately, I served as the portfolio architect for the app decommissioning program for the Wachovia merger. And then I led an effort on portfolio rationalization, decommissioning. I led Cmdb. I led software asset management. I led, wide variety of related things. I never learned that much about banking because, Wells Fargo had close to by the time we bought Wachovia, the IT budget all in was probably $5 or $6 billion, among the top, 10 or 12 IT budgets in the world, maybe among the top 4 or 5. So that was plenty to do. And I had an all access pass. I was working with, not the CIO so much, not even the CIO's directs, but the CIO's 2 downs, because I was constantly trying to figure out the large grained value streams, processes, data stores, what the systems of record were. And I wound up facilitating a lot of meetings about what are we trying to do with this internal data to run the IT organization better? How can we formalize the application portfolio? And what's the relationship of the application portfolio to the Cmdb? And we made great progress on all of that. And I learned a ton, both in terms of hard skills and soft skills. And then I went off I went off to become an analyst at EMA. After the Wachovia merger, there wasn't a lot of room for upwards advancement. The organization was kind of crowded and I wasn't seeing eye to eye with my boss, to be blunt. So like a lot of merger and acquisition, it was a time to take a lateral, and I went off, took a pay cut actually to become an analyst. And at that time, the second edition, I wrote the second edition of my book to catch up with ITIL v3. And this is where things get interesting with IT4IT. Sorry if I've given you too much, you can edit it out. I won't mind. So when I got to Enterprise Management Associates, I spent about 1.5 years there. And towards the end of that period, I got this call from an individual, Karel van Zeeland at Shell. And he calls me up. I have no idea who he is. And he says, hi, I'm the chief architect for the business of IT at Shell. Perhaps you've heard of us. I said, well, okay. Karel, there's not too many of us who can lay claim to that title at that scale. So it's very interesting to meet you. What's up? And he said, well, we have your book and we like it. We use it. And we are working with HP to create something we're calling IT4IT. And the backstory that I didn't know at the time was they had wanted to call it ERP for IT, but found that I owned the domain name. Oh, now I think it's just as well that IT4IT didn't call itself ERP for IT. I think IT4IT is probably a somewhat stronger brand because ERP for IT has some baggage, and I think that we should talk about that. But they invited me in. I was not in on the very ground floor. I want to be clear about that. The initial IT4IT work that HP had started to drive, and this was at a time when Leo Apotheker was the former SAP CEO, was heading up HP. And so there was political interest in solving the problem of the business of IT because HP had a very fragmented portfolio, and customers like Shell were basically saying, look, it's not our job to integrate your portfolio. You've got the Quintana lineage with project portfolio management. You've got the Peregrine lineage with service management. And you need to have an integrated point of view on how all this fits together so that we don't have to do your work for you. And oh, by the way, we're happy to participate. And so they set up what was initially a specialized customer advisory board. And in it, they had not just Shell, but Munich Re, Achmea, Accenture, again, was there, but nobody I knew from my days. And I like the Accenture guy, there. I love him to death. He's still there, Philippe Genest. And a number of other players. And then I was in. And by the time I really had solidified my relationship with IT4IT, I had switched over to AT&T. And AT&T, Shell was a huge customer of AT&T. And so AT&T was like, fine, you go do whatever you want. We've got this group over here that handles industry standard liaisons. Just keep the lines of communication open with them. They were mostly working with the telemanagement forum, but they didn't mind. I found an executive sponsor at AT&T. It wasn't a big deal, and they were happy to support me in doing this stuff, even paid for a little bit of my travel. And so then we were doing the IT for IT consortium and making some interesting headway. But then the problem came up of, well, what do we do? We don't want this. This is not meaningful if it is limited to one major vendor. We need it to be an agnostic, open vendor consortium. And so we had some conversations about how we would do that.
Just
now,
to interrupt, Charles, just to interrupt you, how are you allowed to take part in the IT for IT? Were you a member from the research analyst group? Was that a member, or HP, like you were acting on behalf of HP?
No, IT for IT at the time was a consortium. And so it was purely invitational. They invited me and I attended.
Oh, so
it's not like,
yeah, okay. You didn't have to be a member.
This is before the open group. You were a member if they invited you. And if you expressed interest, you know, I mean, for the most part, these were HP customers, remember. So this is before the open group. Cool. And this is where I played a certain role, because I had some dealings with the object management group. In fact, Dr. Richard Soley had written the foreword to Architecture and Patterns. And so when we started to consider the future of IT for IT, I called him up and said, you know, we've got this thing, IT for IT. What should we do with it? And, you know, we're thinking about creating our own standards org, and I'm not sure that that's going to be too viable, because standards orgs need a business model. You need members, you need, you know, you have to have sponsorship, and you've got legal issues, you got marketing issues, you got all kinds of things. And so my initial going in was like, well, can we align with an existing standards organization rather than trying to stand up our own? And I got tasked with Carol and one other individual, and we had a series of conversations with the object management group, and the object management group also said you should talk to Oasis and the open group. And so we had a round of interviews with all of them. As it turned out, the object management group didn't feel like they were the best home. So we wound up with the open group. And the open group, I think, was a good position, and it's been viable. I mean, it's been a viable standard, you know, for some years now, and continues to make progress. And so at that point, you know, we had become a full-blown standards organization. We changed it from the IT for IT consortium to the IT for IT forum, which is the official open group organizational structure. And, you know, IT for IT continues to make progress and get more and more industry recognition. I can speak as a Forrester analyst. You know, people come to me and they ask about IT for IT. They don't know my background. They don't know my history. They don't know that I played a certain role with it. It is mentioned briefly, you know, in my bio, but most people don't read my bio. But they're mentioning it because they're hearing about it through channels. And
so that's people, that's how in demand it is right now. I think, as you said, the initial intention was to harmonize the tool set from HP, which Shell was. I didn't know that was quite a revelation from
you. No, Shell was, you know, and the thing is that you know, when we compare, if we compare certain pictures, I mean, certainly IT for IT looks a certain way, and it's got a very well-known visual representation, but
both the four streams, the request to study,
all of the various components. But if you look here at my book, you see that there is there's a systems model in my book.
Okay.
You know, which is somewhat similar. Actually, no, that's the data model. Darn it.
Okay.
I can't even tell the difference between a systems model and a data model nowadays. That's tragic. So here, here's the systems model. So this has probably 60% overlap 70% overlap with IT for IT.
Okay, the componentization wherein you break it up into all the components and
yeah.
the
Asset
primary
management
architecture.
system, financial management system, service request management, incident management, change management, security ops, element management, release management. In fact, a lot of this is still pretty accurate. You know, the DevOps and the package managers and the source code repositories need to get worked in. But I mean, I have software configuration management system. That's where your source code and repositories go. I think the one thing we don't have is dev side release automation is what we don't have. We have a release management system.
Okay.
And I guess you could probably cram Jenkins in there.
Okay.
But yeah, it's tick tick tick.
But I think I saw there is package
roughly,
management.
you know,
There is package management, I think, right? Mostly package
in
management is taken
IT
care.
for IT.
Yeah,
Oh,
source code is there. So what was that you're saying? It doesn't combine the dev side of release management. So what is Jenkins?
What I was talking about my component
your
model
book, your
here.
book. Okay.
In my book, I wrote my book really before the rise of DevOps. I mean, DevOps was just starting to take off. Just Humble contributed some insights and reviews to that book.
Correct.
But you know, this book was 2012. I mean, DevOps was still very, very early days.
True. I think I just can relate to your talk in which you said I should have created this standard way back or something. Like that was one of your things. Like, you know, you said, how did I miss something like this? So that was an afterthought. I mean, pretty much after the standard evolved, because you also took part in it. When did you make that comment? When you said that I should have actually come up with that standard myself?
I can't remember. No,
yeah, I think in one of your talks, I remember, like, you know, you just said, I wish I had written the whole standard all by myself. I now miss the chance of having written it now, something like that.
Maybe I can't remember.
Okay.
I mean, Lars Rossen and his team have done a phenomenal job. You know, really shepherding it. And you know, I was heavily involved, and I did a lot of heavy lifting. Eventually, you know, I probably can't, you know, share too much internal, but I decided that my time with the open group was better spent trying to move in some more innovative directions. IT for IT was working well, and I was concerned about the lack of attention to, you know, the business processes, the capabilities, the practices. IT for IT was still being articulated very much at a systems level. And I felt it was important to start bringing in more of the human element, which is why I wrote the DP BOK. But that's the basic history of ERP for IT. Now, like I said, you know, they had been interested in the ERP for IT domain name, although I will say, you know, nobody ever asked me about it. If somebody had asked me, you know, to sell the domain name for, you know, a minor consideration, I probably would have done so, you know, to help promote IT for IT. But at that point, they'd already settled on the internal brand. And, you know, like I said, I think it was for better.
Okay. Yeah.
Now we can certainly talk about ERP for IT. And I think it would be an interesting conversation because ERP for IT is a
just to interrupt you, Charles, there when you said ERP for IT, what you essentially mean is there is a value chain which is connecting all the different departments which IT has to you know, like help and support, like HR, finance, legal, marketing, sales, and all that, which pretty much an ERP does quite well. So what you intend was for companies who don't have that kind of a backbone. So there should be some such system which kind of integrates that pipeline. I think that was the intent, right?
The intent is to provide, if a chief operations officer or a chief financial officer buys Oracle or SAP, they get, and this is what most people think of, they get HR, they get, you know, payroll, benefits, etc. They get general ledger. They get accounts payable, they get accounts receivable, they get cash management, treasury management,
bookkeeping, you know, all of that.
Correct. All of that stuff. And then they can get some vertical specific kinds of things like supply chain. They get certainly, you know, purchasing, contract management, I mean, there's a wide variety. I mean, they have dozens and dozens of modules that ERP vendors do, but basically they run your business. You know, product management, product configuration, and pricing, and now some of this I myself am not. I mean, I'm not the primary ERP lead at my company, but they do a lot. I mean, basically companies run their whole business on SAP, and the rest of IT is kind of an afterthought. It happens
Somewhere in your book also you mentioned that although we talk highly about ERP, the pains and a lot of customer frustrations with implementing an ERP, because they say for every dollar SAP makes, there are $6 that the integrators make. So things don't really integrate.
There's that. Now, but the point I'm trying to make though is that your vendors like SAP and Oracle, they help the chief human resources officer, they help the chief financial officer, they help the chief operations officer.
So it's all under one umbrella mostly.
They do not help the CIO.
Okay.
They do not manage the CIO's own business processes. They never have, and I'm at this point don't think they ever will, unless Oracle buys ServiceNow or something crazy like that, which I would not rule out. But the CIO has significant business challenges. The CIO has portfolio management. The CIO had a lot of project management. Now it's turning more into product management, but a lot of it is internal product management. So it's not, exteriorized product management. They certainly have major operational concerns. They've got all kinds of risk and compliance. They've got workflows. They have end-to-end processes. They have finances. They've got budgeting. They've got vendor management. They've got all these things that they need to do in a somewhat integrated way. And the ERP world just doesn't help the CIO that much. In fact, some of the interfaces like fixed asset management, you wind up with a fixed asset management system inside of Oracle Financials, and then you wind up with an IT asset management system and having to reconcile them. And most large companies are in that position. And so what was interesting to me, what always has been interesting to me, is related to the management of the computing infrastructure, the digital infrastructure.
Isn't it, sorry, Charles, isn't it paradoxical to say that ERP for IT, when ERP itself is fragmented from what you said? So how are we envisaging that they should, I think the way you used ERP was that it's going to solve a lot of problems under its umbrella. So we need to have something like that the CIO doesn't need to go helter-skelter in different places and pretty much have all of that under the same place.
Exactly. CIOs were running their organizations with email and spreadsheets.
True.
There was rarely, systems of record. The systems of record were very limited and very non-functional. I mean, I kept seeing this over and over again in my career throughout those earlier years. And so what was to be done? And that was why I wrote the book, was, to start developing a reference architecture. This is why IT4IT came around. But the trouble is, then we started to run into the problems of Agile. And this is ultimately why ERP for IT is a bad brand for IT and digital. Because ERP, if you dig into the history, ERP came out of MRP, MRP2, and MRP2 came out of the initial MRP. And you know what the initial MRP stood for?
No, I don't even know what's MRP actually. Manufacturing something? Or?
Materials Requirements Planning.
Oh, okay.
Was the original MRP. And then they rebranded it Manufacturing Resource Planning. And then they rebranded it Enterprise Resource Planning. But the origins came from the supply chain problem, which in the mass market was a big problem. You had so much capital, so much money tied up being shipped from here to there. You know, iron ore going from Duluth to Cleveland to the steel mills. Finished steel going from Cleveland to Detroit to be turned into automobiles. Automobiles being shipped out of Detroit all over the country and all over the world. I mean, that's your basic
So there's a huge
chain.
supply chain demand all of a
And
sudden.
the more you can take the goods out of the supply chain and either leave them in the ground until you need them or get them into the hands of the customer and shrink that supply chain, every step you take to shrink the supply chain is money back in your pocket. And this is why MRP was such a big deal, continues to be a big deal if you're running a manufacturing plant. You need to know what you're going to order. You need to order just enough and no more. You don't want to be short and you don't want to be over. If you're short, you miss sales. If you're over, you have wasted stock or supplies or inventory sitting on, sitting on your in your facility that you'll have to sell at a loss or it will spoil. I mean, because not everything is, iron ore that doesn't spoil. And so
This reminds me of the BMW plant in Lipitz, Germany. I believe they are organized in such a way that all the raw materials required for the finished goods are at an arm's length away. And that's how the entire,
right.
the stuff is organized. And so that
ton of respect for manufacturing. And they've figured out, an immense variety of very difficult problems. But taking value out of the supply chain, in the terms of stop, basically optimizing the goods in the supply chain was a big part of it. And that was, now let's get into the math a little bit. Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze here. Let's get into the math a little bit. The algorithms you use to optimize a supply chain, I don't want to make broad characterizations, but many of them are linear. Some of them are nonlinear, and increasingly, I think more of them are nonlinear. But back in the day, the initial problems were handled by a lot of linear algebra, a lot of multiplying matrices.
I think I'm just reminded of the fact that you got inspired by Goldratt's book, The Goal, which was suggested to you by Gene, who actually introduced you to that. So how much of that has actually influenced you in your all of this, actually, when you say IT has huge learnings from manufacturing?
Yeah, no, Goldratt was kind of post ERP. Oh, okay. But the MRP, post MRP, but the original MRP was based on systems of linear constraints. And they would use something called the simplex algorithm, and they would run. I saw a quote somewhere that, for the first 40 years of computing, 80% of all the computing capacity was used on the simplex algorithm. I saw that quote somewhere. I can't find a reference for it. But basically, that's what they bought big machines to do, was to solve systems of linear equations to help optimize supply chains. And, there was such a huge focus on that. Now, the trouble is,
but actually, Goldratt dispelled a lot of myths, I believe, in that. Do you have any learnings from your side, Charles, that
I think yeah, Goldratt. I mean, I've read Beyond the Goal. I mean, I read
Theory of Constraints.
Yeah, Theory of Constraints, and ultimately they wound up with some bad outcomes, having to do with sometimes if you took too much out of the supply chain, if you took too much out of the front end of the supply chain, it showed up negatively on the books. And there was also fallacies about operational capacity. And this is what Goldratt and then the Phoenix Project spend a lot of time debunking and deconstructing, is, the idea that you want to manage, a given service for high utilization, that you want to keep your people busy.
That can be counterproductive.
And that you want to always have enough. So one of Goldratt's books, I forget which one, is all about a systematic deconstruction of this idea that we should always have enough stock in hand to keep the people busy. True. And that's where we got into the great war between, that side of that viewpoint versus lean coming out of Japan. We're like, we don't have the money. We have plenty people. We don't have the money to keep big piles of iron ore around. And in any event, why are we producing all this stuff if there isn't a clear market signal for it? So the goals of very important additional, I mean, we're trying to, I'm trying to cover a lot of business and
I think the
operational
IT correlation there is, I think you mentioned in your book that sometimes we are trying to reduce the very process of trying to reduce waste is actually leading to counterproductive, and it leads to more waste.
It results in waste.
Yeah, it results in more waste.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to be very careful as you identify waste.
Correct.
So this is why ERP, so to cut to the chase here, and I'm sure you're going to want to edit some of this. To cut to the chase here, this is why ERP for IT is a bad idea. Because ERP systems, they in earlier iterations, they drove bad business outcomes in some ways. And certainly you cannot reduce complex systems down to linear equations. I mean, this is the difference between, you have one branch of math that's all about, linear constraints. You have other branches of math that understand that complex systems are exponential, systems dynamics. And you can solve a system of linear equations. You cannot solve a system of nonlinear equations. A system of linear equations has a solution. There are ways to derive that solution. It might take a lot of computing power, depending on how complex the system of linear equations is. But it is known how to solve a system of linear equations or determine that there is no solution.
I think now it's an age of continuous everything. And that makes a lot of sense because everything is exponentially changing. It's all too dynamic. It's no more an assembly line. So even though we may say DevOps is the IT assembly line, but I think the rate at which people are producing code and churning out to keep in pace is huge.
You can call it an assembly line, but I can tell you there's no MRP at the front of it. At the front of every physical assembly line is an MRP system.
True.
At the front of a DevOps supply chain, a DevOps pipeline, is a set of poorly formed ideas that people are going to gradually turn into functionality. And that is not something that you're going to apply a system of linear equations to. And so what is the math? How do we automate this problem? How do we get computers to better help us actually organize their own programming? It's an interesting question. And this is where DevOps has come in. And this is also where IT service management, enterprise service management come in, because these problems are not inherent only to IT. They are inherent to all knowledge work. Knowledge work, I mean, if I am going to make a mouse, I am using resins, I am molding, or forging, stamping gears, I am assembling the mouse, I'm putting in a small circuit board. This is all very, very prescriptive and uses manufacturing. If I am building a new software system, it is nowhere near as prescriptive. In fact, the software system really ultimately culminates in a set of interactions between me and a computer. And interactions like we're having over Zoom. Zoom is a platform. You and I are having a conversation over Zoom. Zoom, was built as a product, but it started off with somebody having the idea, I think I can compete in the video conferencing space, but they didn't come to it with predefined amounts of capital and inventory and a assembly line for building a video conferencing system.
That brings me to the next point of your idea of emergent architecture, right? People these days, it's more of emergent architecture. As you walk, the path appears. So it's not that you know where you want to go from point A to B.
Exactly.
So the path appears as you walk. So keep walking.
Right. No, and in ERP, really the assumption is that you've got a much stronger idea of point A to point B. Now, even in manufacturing, they are dealing with the volatility of the current economy. And they are building manufacturing plants like the BMW plant that you referenced to be much more flexible so that they can reconfigure them immediately. They're moving away from fixed rail assembly lines and they're putting the car chassis on programmable carts. And so the factory floor just becomes this big virtual space, and you can have, 4 assembly lines in it one day and 10 the next. And it probably takes a little longer than that. But Mick Kirsten writes a lot about this.
Correct. I think he refers to Joe Justice's work, wherein they created an entire automobile out of crowdsourced ideas, like using Scrum for hardware, like as you said.
Right.
Scrum for
it's
hardware.
all about, we get better and better at manipulating the physical atoms. And so then what is left for us to think about is the hard, complex, emergent problems of human cognition and human information processing and the human interaction with the complex socio-technical system. And yet, there still is a need for certain information structures, for certain flows of information. That doesn't go away, which is why even in this day and age, I still get 3 or 4 calls a week on Cmdb, for example.
Correct.
Because there's an information management problem at the heart of digital systems, and people need those abstractions to run the digital systems correctly. And we also have emergent problems around, well, how do we effectively manage product teams? Everybody's pivoting from project to product. How do we identify when a product team is under excessive cognitive load? How do we identify when one product team probably should become 2? Can we use the information we see in the environment to help us make a better decision there? Can we start running some machine learning on the patterns? We have developers who every day are checking code into GitHub and merging it, branching it, and merging it. What can we learn from those behaviors in terms of their overall correlation with business benefits and profitability, as well as customer satisfaction? And so there's a whole world of digital phenomena, digital telemetry. And I use the word telemetry deliberately in a provocative way, because people talking to people is telemetry in a sense. I mean, if I was to record this conversation and analyze it, that's a form of telemetry, as well as the system-to-system interactions that we tend to associate with telemetry. It's all just one big information feed. The system interacting with other systems, the system interacting with a human, the human interacting with a system, the human is interacting with each other in the context of a system like this, or with respect to a given system. It's all part of the large socio-technical system. What is the math of that? What is these are, you can call them resources if you want. Now, people get angry. People are not resources. Well, that's a religious, an ideological argument. I don't care if I'm reading a paper that calls people resources. I don't sit there and fret about the fact that people have been dehumanized. I think that's kind of a waste of time. You're up against 80 years of operations research that calls people resources. So, go knock yourself out. I think the real challenge is, how do you treat people? That's the question. And anyways, I digress. So that's kind of the ERP for IT journey, and not in a nutshell, in 50 probably long-winded minutes.
So actually, Charles, in spite of the fact that you said there should be a central CMDB, you have tools for config management, service management, event management, incident management, problem management, change management, diagnostics. So in your Forrester wave, when you say this tool is up here, this is a little bit here. So how does it all tie up? Because HP doesn't have an answer for it. ServiceNow also doesn't have the whole problem solved. So
you need an information architecture.
Correct. Even now it's broken now, as you said. CMDB is largely broken in spite of all these big companies out there, shipping out their wares.
Well, it's because it's only ever been part of the problem. I can share a modern information architecture here. So I'm just going to share my screen, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
This is going to take a couple seconds. I just opened up an enormous presentation. Although it's going faster.
I need to make you the host. So
yes.
I'm doing that.
Do you see this?
Yes, yes, yes.
So, geez, I always wind up having to swap. So this is the current, my high level information architecture of the digital pipeline. You'll notice there's still a CMDB there, but we certainly aren't putting everything in the CMDB.
Okay.
There's the highest volume data store here is the log store by far. And you also have artifact repositories, you have portfolio management, you have smaller data stores over in IT operations management, you have reference data, you have a digital value stream management data warehouse, and then you have a CMDB that ties a lot of it all together in terms of providing a system of record for the logical and physical concepts. But all of this needs to interoperate, which is why master data becomes so critical in managing large-scale digital pipelines.
So how is this going to be architected, Charles? Just to interrupt you.
This isn't architecture. Okay. If you're talking about how it will be allocated.
Yeah, no, what I mean to say is, let us say there is a configuration asset ID that needs to be linked to the service management dashboard, that needs to be linked to the event dashboard. So how is the chaining, that service chaining that's going to happen across all of these guys?
That's why you need master data management.
Oh, and where is that in this picture here?
That would be. I think that master data management mostly should live in the core ESM space. There is an API management aspect as well that I think becomes increasingly important, and I think needs to probably be a layer in here that's not necessarily articulated. But basically, I would say that the key master data, like the product or application tagging, that should be available on demand from an API from the core ESM system. The ESM is the same as ITSM. Okay, it's a broader. It's ServiceNow basically is the core ESM or BMC or whoever. Okay. And then you have a CMDB. You have perhaps some internal NoSQL. You've got a really important function that brings it all together, next-gen discovery and analysis, which is AI ops, and basically running analytics that bring together any or all of the major data here. And this is ultimately, where we start to be able to more intelligently understand and manage the entire system of systems here. But there's no one vendor at this point that does all of this. There is no ERP. If this is an ERP for IT architecture, there is no ERP for IT vendor. ServiceNow is, in fact, HP is also trying to. Atlassian is actually the closest. Atlassian is the closest thing we have to an ERP for IT vendor.
Okay. With Jira, Jenkins, and Sonar and all that under there.
They don't have Jenkins or Sonar, but they've got Bitbucket. And Bitbucket pipelines, and they have OpsGenie, and they have Jira. They have Jira Service Desk. They have Jira for developers. Okay. So basically, Atlassian has a story.
So they're better than ServiceNow, or is it, Charles?
Yeah, because ServiceNow doesn't have the upstream stuff. ServiceNow is not competitive with Jira.
Correct. Because these guys are more at the operational level. ServiceNow is more operational, whereas I guess Jira is at the development and build phase as well.
And ServiceNow does not have an equivalent of Bitbucket.
Okay.
ServiceNow does not manage source code or artifacts.
True.
So package management, ServiceNow does not do package management. They're relying on others to do that. And so, this is where, there's some significant,
Is this your futuristic architecture of how things should be out of your own brain dump, or
it is how things...
This is a reflection of the industry right now.
It's a reflection of the industry right now.
Oh, okay.
I mean, this is how people are managing it today. Okay. We're going to have to wrap up. I would like a few minutes before my next meeting.
Sure, Charles. I think we will do that. So I think just before we wind up, one last aha moment that you had in your service management journey that you could read some anecdotal thing that you had with your customers or something like that that really stands out. Like if you were to summarize your stuff, your journey across the different years, like what is that single thing that stood out and it was quite colorful that way?
Wow.
I'm sure there could be many, but in the
There's
interest of
many.
time,
There's
in the
many.
interest
But
of
I
time,
think
perhaps whatever comes.
the past year, the aha moment for me has been that DevOps and ESM need each other.
Okay. Okay.
And that brings up, I'll just do a quick preview of a key graphic here. So do you see a Word document?
Yes, I'm able to see a Word document, DevOps,
Let me expand it here.
The inverted 8, actually, DevOps and DevOps connection.
So I'll leave you with this. This is the future architecture. This is the future ERP for IT.
Okay.
Is the DevOps loop being run by product teams, digital product teams, who are being supported by enterprise services, and the enterprise services themselves adopt the product approach.
Oh, okay. Okay.
This is how ESM and DevOps come together. There's been a lot of discussion around things like change management. I think that that's been a distraction.
True.
Because obviously we need ESM to provide the services. Any given DevOps team, if you're operating at scale, you need access to other services. You need to be able to find the other teams because products depend on products. And so how do you negotiate those dependencies? And so we need to have an overall integrated architecture that brings together DevOps and enterprise service management. So that's what I'll have to leave you with today.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I think DevOps is the way forward as long as it integrates quite well with Ops and Dev, and there are a lot of things that it opens a Pandora box. So it's like how well you're able to fix security, performance, and all that other non-functional bits once you're churning out code at this speed. So I think great, Charles. So not taking much of your time because I know you need to step to other things. More, important.
Great to talk to you again. And
thanks, Charles. Thanks very much for your time. It was great having you. And I look forward to your sharing of the blog on your Dropbox, as you said, later on. So do share me when you're free.
Okay.
Thanks a lot and have a great day as well.